Welcome to Lead Smarter, Not Harder, your stop for how to stand out as a leader. I'm your host, Jason Davis, and this week we are joined by leadership speaker, educator, and top-ranked LinkedIn Learning author, Dr. Todd Dewett, as we talk about a few foundational elements of leadership. You don't want to miss a second of this show. Let's go! All right. Well, wanted to get together today and talk about manager fundamentals, really kind of bringing it back and getting back to basics and getting the basics right. So there's a lot that can be explored in that space. There's a lot to do and probably 4, 5, 6 podcasts worth of material that can be made out of that. But I wanted to make sure I brought in some good expertise. So I've got a great guest this week. Dr. Todd Dewett is joining me on the podcast this week with some really good insights on manager fundamentals and just, from a leadership journalist standpoint. So a little bit about Todd. Todd's professional journey began with degrees from the University of Memphis and the University of Tennessee. Followed by some time with Anderson Consulting, which is now Accenture, as well as Ernst & Young. Todd received his PhD from Texas A&M University, Mays Business School in organizational behavior. As an educator, Todd has over 30 million people that have enjoyed content that he has created and is a 3-time #1 author on LinkedIn Learning. As a speaker, Todd has given over 1,000 professional speeches, including a 4-time TEDx speaker, and Inc. magazine named him a top 100 leadership speaker. Todd, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you so much. I appreciate that kind intro. Yes, I've been around.
Absolutely. It sounds like. All right. So what did I miss out of your background? Anything critical you want to throw in or add into the conversation there?
It's funny. I was talking to someone about one of my courses the other day. It was about pitching yourself, the proverbial elevator speech. And I just tell people that I make courses, give speeches, and write books about leadership related stuff.
Yeah. Awesome. Keeping it simple. It simple. So, and again, thank you so much for coming on and getting into this conversation with me. I know we kind of chatted a couple of weeks ago and just kicking some ideas around and getting that together. But, real quick, what's your personal connection to this topic? Why are you passionate about managers and leadership and really kind of putting that in the right path?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, the explanation for how did I even get here kind of answers that question, because I remember working for Anderson and Ernst & Young and noticing really quick as a young professional, some people-related things that didn't make sense to me and some relationship-related issues that seemed to define great performance and a whole lot of mediocrity in performance. One of the things I do remember going through was an onboarding process at these big professional services firms that in some ways I found useful and in some ways I found completely lacking and off-putting, frankly. And then later as a scholar and now as a general writer, commentator person, boy, do those observations ring true about their impact on the individual and their impact eventually on the team and the organization.
Yeah, you're so right. And, I think especially with things in the onboarding space and just bringing people into a company and stuff like that, a lot of those same issues that you saw then are very much still prevalent today and could even be kind of escalated or heightened a little bit with people being remote and not necessarily having that one-to-one onboarding or just that meeting experience of their coworkers and stuff like that. So I think it's, one that you might be seeing it anyway. It's a little bit of an elevated issue from that.
There's no doubt about it. The pandemic has taken a whole lot of things and made them more front and center than they were already. Onboarding, as an example, was already something that's applied very diversely, meaning sometimes it's avoided, skipped, unnecessary. Why would I waste time and resources on that? Other times it's engaged very poorly, sometimes quite mediocre, adequately. Other times it's thoughtful beyond words. But the average is still not impressive, which is why people like me are still talking about it. And the pandemic, you're right, has made it worse because, we lack some of the face-to-face time that really is the backbone of making connection.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a great transition really into what I think is a good first foundational topic for us to dig a little bit further. So onboarding, I think you can simply put it as, bringing somebody new into a company or a team. They may be changing roles, going to a new different area of the company or something like that. So you've got bringing people into a company, bringing people into a team. Why is that time period so important from a manager's standpoint or a manager's point of view?
We used to not understand it very well 50 years ago, and we just threw people in the deep end. Hey, it's your first day of work. Welcome. You thought you were going to do A. We're going to have you do B, C, and D, and your job, and then ask them to fill out paperwork and maybe tell them something about the company. What we now know from organizational science studying this topic a lot is that how a person is treated, how they're informed, how they're welcomed, how they're readied for the job they've been hired to do, has a massive, quick impact on how they feel, how they perform, and their tenure. In fact, a big chunk of turnover, not just managerial, but even non-managerial, a big chunk, as much as 20, 30% sometimes, happens within a month of getting hired based on a few factors. And one of them really is onboarding. And then even if someone had let's call it questionable onboarding period where information wasn't made clear and the job role wasn't quite clear and et cetera, it's no buddy system, no nothing. Even they want to hang on, keep their commitment, so to speak, right? And stay at the job and work hard anyway. You absolutely planted a seed that weakens their commitment. So the punchline, the research is pretty clear. Why do we even care about a thoughtful onboarding process? It's because we tend to move people from minimal compliance towards this thing we call commitment. That is a mouthful, believe me. Minimal compliance says, I'm going to give just enough to do what I think is required of me and asked of me, and not more. But commitment says, I'm invested. I get it. I don't see just a paycheck. I feel a little purpose. I'm going to look for ways to add value, period. Those are two radically different things. And what I'm telling you is that onboarding is not all by itself, but onboarding is a process of thoughtfully moving a person from one of those to the higher level one commitments. Why wouldn't you, with that stuff at stake, want to care about onboarding? It's an investment. It's not an expense.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've talked about that before in the sense of, low discretionary effort, high discretionary effort. And, so very similar concepts in the way we're thinking about it there. And even from my own experience in onboarding employees, I did this for a few years at my prior company. We learned that we were doing it all wrong, at the very beginning, right? It's like, okay, here's the HR stuff day one, and now we're going to get right into the material, right? And then it took us a little while to figure out and some feedback to figure out like, hey, wait a minute, like I need to learn what you all do here. And, how am I going to make a difference to the customers that you serve or that you support or that are a part of your company? Like, what is my role in helping them, in this case, kind of restore their life, right? How do I make those things happen? I think was a real eye opener for us into, all right, you need to spend a decent amount of time in really connecting that purpose. So they understand why they're there, why they're going to come to work every day, other than collecting a paycheck.
You got it. So HR pros in the last 3 decades have really continued, and we're not done, evolving from informing people and checking the boxes we need to check. This was filled out, this was signed, this was established, et cetera, to realizing that is really only step one. And the real goal of onboarding is to begin helping that person be successful for the long term. That sounds so grandiose, but that's exactly what the job is.
Yeah, precisely. So from that manager's point of view, why should they be involved in that beyond filling out all the paperwork or helping that person facilitate that stuff?
It's a great question. You definitely have to care about filling out paperwork, checking, but all of that's very important for dotting your I's, crossing your T's. But the truth is that's not where great performance comes from. Great performance comes from solid relationships. I like to talk about comfort and rapport a lot. So the sooner you can inject real people to your new hires, I'm talking about video calls, phone calls, or a lunch even before a start date or something that might sound absurd to other busy professionals. Those are genuine and they have to be sincere, of course. But those are amazing investments in someone feeling not lost, not in between, not in transition, transition, but a part of something and more comfortable in that transition period. It's not that complex. They want to feel like someone is thinking about them and hoping that they're kind of not flailing around and understand what's going on and aren't, what do we do when we lack information? We see black helicopters. You've probably heard versions of that many times. So many new hires who are onboarded not at all or poorly see black helicopters everywhere because the company, unintentionally usually, left way too many question marks in their field of view. So you want to get people involved quickly aside from all the paperwork so that, you never know. You think you're going to know. And that's why you put together your paperwork with answers to those 10 questions, but you never know until you ask what's really on their mind and what concerns that person. Jason, I'm looking at this person right here. What makes him tick? What's going to make him more comfortable, more ready, more excited, frankly, more comfortable when they start their job? All of that should be established long before the first day of work, for sure.
Yeah, and it's such a great point. And I've heard of companies doing more and more of this, and really, all right, as soon as that offer is accepted, onboarding starts, right? They're not even within our employee systems or anything like that yet. I'm still emailing a personal email address, but onboarding starts, as soon as they accept that offer. And you brought it up. I've seen, other companies, they'll do quick intro videos, like from the manager to the, their new employee and stuff like that, so that you can start to build that relationship, really early on and start to feel like people from the employee's perspective when you start, right? When you walk in that door and when you start meeting people, it's like, okay, I already know this guy or gal because, we've talked on the phone, we've shared some videos, I know what they're about. We connected on LinkedIn, like getting all that stuff out of the way. No reason it has to wait the 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever before somebody starts. So
I like to rephrase what we've just tried to say in a particular way when I talk to managers and they're thinking about expenses instead of investments. So anytime you're going into a new situation professionally, especially a new job, new team, you feel a little risk, a little apprehension, knowing that there's learning curves about understanding the rules and the relationships. You can reduce that by all the investments we've just been ranting about for a few minutes. That's what you're doing. You're reducing the feeling of apprehension or risk associated with them walking in the first day because they feel meaningfully, partially informed, even though they haven't been there. That's priceless.
Yeah. And if you want to think about it from the manager perspective as well, it might lighten that load in the initial onboarding period if you're not cramming everything into, all right, when they first show up at the door, right? That's not your first introduction. Our first introduction was 2 weeks ago, and we've started this whole process. We already started the relationship building. Now we can start to really get to the things we got to do, and then building that person up to be a great employee.
I have to take what you just said and say, man, yeah, that's a big statement. Mr. Manager, Mrs. Manager, how am I going to convince you to listen to me and Jason today? I'm going to tell you this. You want them to get up the learning curve and get productive as fast as possible, not as slow as possible. All of these onboarding activities have certain positive outcomes associated with them. Tenure is one of them. Speaking good of the team and the company to others, that's a beautiful one that we've seen many times. Here's the best one, Mr. or Mrs. Manager. It's having someone get productive quickly, because usually that's predicated on knowledge and on rapport, which leads to conversations, questions, things they need to do to help them get up the learning curve. That happens faster when you invest in onboarding. I mean, that's a beautiful sales pitch.
Right. Yeah. Give them that feeling of safety to go ask questions and to say, hey, I don't understand how to do this job. I want to figure it out, but I need a little bit of help. Again, giving, especially new employees, right, that, scared or skeptical, or, they don't see anybody else going to ask their boss questions or anything like that. It gives them that little bit of psychological safety to say, hey, I need to figure this out. I'm going to go ask a question, and I'm hopefully going to learn from it and not have to ask it over and over again. That's on the employee side, but, giving them that, okay, I'm going to go do this. I'm just going to go ask because I can't figure it out on my own somehow. So
precisely correct.
I think that's great. So, so from thinking about that manager's point of view, what would you say are some of the most important things that the manager can do during onboarding, if it's not kind of getting out and starting that early?
Well, there's a concept that I've loved for 30 years now. It's called realistic job preview. It's not as popular a label as it was years ago, but the practice is still there. The idea is simple, and it came from scholarship, HR related scholarship. The idea is the more we tell them honest things about life here at this new job, as opposed to posturing and giving them the marketing take on what we do, which so many companies still do. Let me tell you what's so great about our culture. And then what's lived there every day, of course, deviates from that either a little or a lot. So the realistic job preview, I'll give you an example. I had an internship, true story. I had an internship when I was doing my MBA at the University of Tennessee. It was between year 1 and year 2 for a little software firm. I was employee 32, I think, at the time. And anyhow, I was having day 1 discussions with the president of the firm, which was the guy I was going to support for several months on a few projects. And he just looked at me one day as if I was uncomfortable, and he read it in my face. He goes, "Are you sure you want to do this? I'm telling you right now that the floors are dirty and the urinals stink, and it's not going to change." That was a beautiful, honest, realistic preview of the kind of rough around the edges, candor-filled environment that was that job. And he was correct in sharing that with me. And I felt a burden lifted and a rapport established just because of that authenticity in this guy's comments to me. That's a realistic job preview. And if we could do that in onboarding, now I'm not saying you're supposed to go, "Janet's crazy, stay away from Janet." I'm not saying that. I am saying that you should always enjoy the platitudes we've written and put on the website and put out in our pamphlets and what have you. But you should get past that too and go, this is also sometimes a very stressful place. There's just no doubt about that. For example, when we come to month-end activities, which we've talked to you a little bit about, hours go up, stress goes up, and you'll see it in people's eyes. And we try to be mindful of it, but it's definitely a reality. That's a nice example of a straight up realistic job preview. The more we can attempt to embrace those, this is brilliant. The less they surprise people when they happen, they feel almost prepared for it. Like, yeah, they said that. I'm not shocked or offended. I keep working. I keep focused.
Yeah, your example there reminded me of a story when I had first started working at a call center one time, and we're being introduced to the leadership team, and every manager comes out, gives their name, gives their tenure, and then every single one of them says, "And I'm happy to be here." I'm like, no, you're not. Like, not everybody, like, not every single one of you is happy to be here. I know that just by the numbers. But kind of getting back to that point of, and that kind of became a like consistent message from the leadership team. And then when I became a trainer in that facility, that was kind of the message that my trainees were receiving. And then I had to be the one to kind of come in and say, okay, this is a hard job. And this was a claims service center, basically. You're taking calls on people that just got into an auto accident. That's an emotional situation, right? Like really setting that stage up and saying, all right, you just heard "and I'm happy to be here" conversation. All right, this is a tough job, and so, we tried to introduce them to that in the hiring process, but even during onboarding, very, very early on, to say, these are the types of calls you're going to get. If this isn't for you, now's the time to say it. This
might be a little strong, Jason, but I've actually heard about people in onboarding situations sharing, hey, you know what? We do exit interviews. We've got X amount of turnover, which relates blah, blah to the industry average. And we actually found 3 things that people are most interested in, for better or for worse, that help explain their exit. And I'm going to share those with you because we're aware of them. We care about them and we're working on them. That's a brutal truth. So there's this weird thing, maybe I don't want to be too off topic here, but in society and inside organizational life, there's this evolution that's happening. In society, I think of Simone Biles and the mental health issues that she's had us all talking about in the Olympics. And in organizational life and life in general, we are slowly and erratically normalizing the value and the importance of mental health. At work, and we're lagging behind society, but at work, we are starting to do the same thing, which is where this realistic job preview is actually useful from a well-being perspective. You don't want people bombarded later with the reality that's difficult, that they never saw coming.
Yeah, it's the old bait and switch. They told me this nice fruity environment, but then the only calls I get are from people that are mad. And it's like, well, wait a minute. That's not what I had thought I was signing up for when I applied and accepted the role.
Can't imagine. That'd be a tough job.
It is. It is. So interesting. Never a dull moment in that type of environment. But let's scope out a little bit and step away from just individual managers and employees, but let's scope out a little bit and look at teams. So one of your keynote talks that you give is around building teams that transform, and in that you talk a little bit about ownership on the team. So what do you mean by that, and how is a manager creating ownership?
It's one of my favorite topics. I'm happy to address that. Here's a funny thing. Adults don't like to be treated like children when they're at work. Sounds pretty obvious. We can laugh at it, right? Nonetheless, we very often treat them like children. So what we know about the highest performing teams is that they're the least in need of traditional management. They're not without a need for a leader, not without a need for good management. But they are less in need of it because they tend to be self-motivated and talking amongst themselves in a control perspective, much more than a mediocre or low-performing team. So the word I love to talk about most is autonomy. The idea is simple. To the extent that is reasonable, how much can I give Jason the room he needs to do his job as he sees fit? So the problem tons and tons of managers get involved with every day, I've seen this a million times, is that they want to muck around in the details. Comes from a good place, doesn't create good outcomes. They want to do some version of micromanaging. We've all heard it, and there's a reason we still talk about it because it's still a tendency that we act on unproductively. Autonomy says, I'm not going to care about the process as much. I'm going to care about the outcomes that they create. I'm going to only get involved in that process in a, let's call it micromanaging way, when the outcomes aren't what I've set for expectations or what we've agreed upon collaboratively as the expectations. So I love to remind people, you're managing the outcomes, not the process, until there's not need for an intervention. Then you get involved with the process. But generally speaking, the goal is always to stay away and check in periodically, but not frequently, and let people do their darn job. Now, the research is quite clear. When you attempt very clearly to give people meaningful autonomy in their work, they feel a higher sense of ownership. And what that means is with no one beating them in any way, shape, or form, or putting a carrot in front of their face, they will dig in and get the work done in the face of challenges. They will espouse the goodness of their group more. They will seek to support others and do backup types of behaviors. And those are essential. You want a high-performing team? It's not I have my role and he has his. It's we all get things done together. And you don't see that unless people feel respected as adults. And that's where the autonomy / the ownership it creates really plays a big factor.
Yeah, and that's really where you started. That is kind of getting in and mucking with the details. That's where I see a lot of newer, fresher, lesser experienced frontline managers are really bad at that, right? Because most of the time the frontline manager is coming from the job, right? Whatever the job is being done, the main job that's being done in that location, they were good at that. Yep. And then, for one reason or another, they were put into a leadership or manager role, and then they just can't get out of the details, right? They're working in the work and not working on their team, so to speak, and giving them that empowerment or that ownership to solve problems, maybe fail a couple of times and learn from that, right? We got to, open that up a little bit. So it very, very much connects to what I'm seeing on the front line anyway. So
what they don't think of, which you just nailed, is that we want people who will not just do their job, but they'll do their job while looking for ways that we can do what we do differently and better tomorrow. Some appreciation of the ideas of change, innovation, creativity, right? And you don't do that. Adults won't do that and take on the risks they rightly perceive in those behaviors unless they're comfortable with and trust and respect the person supervising them, which is funny. Number one reason someone gets promoted, I'm just really trying to validate you because I loved your comments. Number one reason is because they're good at their job, not that they've showed any kind of amazing specific skills over here that suggest they could be leaders of other humans, but they were a great staff accountant or whatever it is. And then you throw them into a leadership role, and it's a very, just fundamental to say this, I hope that someone needs to hear this, very different set of skills once you're running a team instead of being a high performer on a team. That's a brutal reality a lot of people have to relate. We talked about onboarding earlier. There is a leadership training development corollary here, which is that before you do that, yes, you got to select the right person, but you also want to prepare that person, just like onboarding was supposed to prepare you to start with the firm. You want to prepare leaders to lead. Ideally, I know that's hard to do. We need time, we need money. I know, but ideally the investment pays off because they don't do all the numbskull things that we know rookies too often do.
Yeah. And so I even in my LinkedIn banner, I've got a stat that 70% of frontline managers were not being developed for the role that they ended up taking on, or they weren't aware that they were going to end up taking on that role, which it tells me two things. One, it gets me back to, okay, most of them are being hired from within, because you're not going to hire an external frontline manager that's not developing to be a manager or has no experience. But two, that only 3 out of 10 of them are actually being developed for that, right? Either through their self-identification or through high performance identification or something, right? But only 3 out of 10 are actually being developed to move into that next step.
Why do you think that's true?
It's a great question. I think most often, I feel like anyway, that people are refilling roles based on demand, right? They're not necessarily planning for succession very well. They talk about it, but they don't do it very well. And benches are not very strong right now. That's what I feel like anyway.
I think that's a big part of it. And then, actually, I got to mention another one. We were talking offline about my latest book, Live Hard. And it's a bunch of stories. One of the stories makes a funny comment that relates to what we're talking about. It's this idea. Why don't we develop leaders like you and I know we should be? Only, 3 out of 10 or something. I ask people that over the years many times because I can't believe we'll throw just anybody with a pulse into a leadership role. So it baffles me, given the power they have to impact people positively and negatively. And that's a lot, positive and why aren't we doing more? And I've heard, well, you can't teach people to be leaders and we don't know the full body of knowledge. How would you teach it anyway? And just, it blows my mind. We will, as for example, as local municipalities, we will go out of our way to make sure teenagers and little kids selling Kool-Aid at lemonade stands, this is in the media all the time, are busted and given a ticket for not having the right license to do what they're doing. So, but then we take a human at work with very real power to help someone create passion and fulfillment on the one hand, or ulcers on the other hand, and we vet them nada and say, here's the keys to the kingdom, go. And as a former recovering scholar, I have to tell you, the body of knowledge is well known. The basics about what it means to understand yourself, think about a team, and embrace quality decision-making isn't radically complex. The idea that we could not vet better is bunk. And usually I'll end my rant, forgive me, Jason, I'll end my rant by saying, listen, I don't have to tell you, hey, take my word for it. We've got a couple decades of amazing data out there about the performance of organizations and teams who invest more instead of less in these types of things. And on average, guess what? Shocker, they perform better.
Yeah. There's a couple of, I'm a stat head, so I got all these stats just sitting on top of my head, but Gartner has some data around this as well, and maybe Gartner Gallup, I don't know. But they say that 82% of the time companies pick the wrong managers. So we're not doing very well from for thinking about batting average. But they say that that's also because only 1 out of 10 people actually have the skills to naturally lead people, which gets back to, you got to build them that's the only way you're going to succeed is you got to know that and build those skills. But we're not, clearly, because people aren't being developed for it. And then we're just selecting people without proper vetting or really knowing, can you motivate people and get in there? So, yeah, and it is funny. It said that, being a 1 out of 10, most often, that, that's a good thing, that at least there's a leader on every team, but it's probably not the actual leader on that team. So I thought that was interesting.
It's a brutal stat, man. It's a really brutal stat. And for anyone that's listening, I'm going to think about one word in particular that you just used, and that word is skill, because even though there might be a person more naturally inclined, say 1 out of 10, to have the skill set, the truth is, assuming you're not radically divergent from the needed skill set, because we can't meaningfully change your personality, for example. Having said that, the leadership is still best viewed as a skill. That is to say, with thoughtful focus, time, and patience, things you can learn to do, which is so important to share with anyone listening to these types of topics.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a good way to actually transition into relationships. So we brought this up a couple of times, and really, it lives in both the onboarding space, it lives in the ownership space as well. So it's, and it's a topic that I get into quite a bit. How are authentic relationships built between manager and employees?
Well, it's funny that, by the way, you're right. This stuff is all so interestingly related. That's why I chose, by the way, not that you care, but that's why I ended up choosing, it was thoughtful, to be an interesting leadership generalist as a career, as opposed to a hardcore specialist with 1 or 2 niches that go very deep, because I love the interconnectedness. And I think the practicing manager really gets that and can relate in conversation to someone that sees that these seemingly disparate pain points that define their week, in fact, are terribly related and should be considered as such. So anyhow, funny observation. Back to the consulting days before I became a dorky ivory tower guy, I noticed that there were all kinds of people at work, posturing, and more posturing. Dare I say acting, which is, of course, funny because none of us were trained to be actors. But that's what we do. We manage impressions, and it comes from a good place. So we want to be socially smart and acceptable and meet the expectations of key people around us. That is a sign of intelligence for sure. It's also overindulged a lot, usually way too much in a lot of teams, a lot of organizations. And so what you have at work are well-intentioned, capable people who really choose, kind of funny if you think about it, choose more distant, measured, cold, professional relationships as opposed to what they see as more risky, personal, informed, warm, authentic, real relationships. That kind of observation hit me hard and drove me eventually to the ivory tower to study these types of things. And now, as a writer, speaker, observer, full-time guy, I have to tell you, we've made progress in a lot of the platitudes and policies in organizations, and that's wonderful. But the average relationship hasn't shifted as much as I want. We as humans still feel weirdness when we get into social situations and succumb to perceived norms quickly, such that instead of saying, let me tell you what I actually think, we first go through a weird calculus about what would be okay to say and what would be not okay to say. And so what I love to remind people is that you probably weren't trained to be an actor, number one. Number two, the more you act, the more the person of average intelligence around you can sense insincerity. That's a true thing, man. And that's not useful for relationship building, rapport building. And number three, others, just like you, crave a little more, not a little less, real authenticity. So that's the pitch. I know people want to push back on it, ask how do you make that happen? And I'll let you take it where you want to, but that's the pitch. We know in terms of punchlines that teams that let the filters down, they never go away completely, and they probably shouldn't, but let the filters down a little, engage as people, not just professionals, tend to have all the outcome metrics that we care about in better positions, the performance, the tenure, the loyalty, all of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And from my experience, the insincerity, the being unauthentic or just not being, it smells. You can, you can smell and see that, taking place in a meeting or in a conversation, with leaders or other people. And it absolutely has an erosion on what that relationship is or what it could be kind of between there. And you also hit on a little bit, probably one of my favorite ways to really develop that authenticity was showing vulnerability, being open to vulnerability or showing a little bit of that, like, hey, I don't know all of it, or I don't necessarily know how to do this, or, hey, there's other people in the team that have great skills here. Let's tap into that, and kind of moving into that space and just kind of aligning with your team in that way is a great way, anyway.
Vulnerability is highly related to the conversation around authenticity. I'll give your listeners a very specific, because I want to be useful if possible, a very specific thing you can think about and then figure out how to use that will build authenticity, how authentic you're viewed by others, and it will force you to be a little vulnerable. The concept is mistakes. We all make them. We're all imperfect. We all know this. I've had plenty. In fact, I've made a living out of talking about them and how they taught me things. Probably my most famous mistake story is called the State Farm story. I'll spare you the story because it's long, but the punchline is that I was hired for my first big fat gig as a speaker years ago by State Farm. And I thought I knew what I was doing because I had success in the classroom. And then I learned the hard way that these are very different environments, to say the least. And when you get on stage to deliver a keynote, it's a very different thing. And I acted like a professor in the classroom up there at my first big gig and bombed badly in a room full of 500 senior leaders from State Farm. And it was painful. And I learned a ton, long story short. And so what I like to tell people is that authenticity doesn't have to be weird. Start with the toe in the water. Try to be less rigid than you were last week. Build a little comfort with that and expand. And one of the fun ways to do that isn't just language or how you dress. Those are useful, very useful. But it's talking about yourself in a way that can make others loosen up a little bit and feel human, frankly, because when a person who's accomplished says, let me tell you about a time I was scared, failed, screwed up, made a mistake, upset the customer, et cetera, this is so important. Ready? That's not just you being vulnerable. That's you making others feel more okay about being human too. That's priceless. And yet I ask audiences all the time, how often do you remember in a big environment where a man or woman had a big microphone that they laughed at themselves, humbled themselves, told the big mistake story? And it's very rare. And it happens, and it's wonderful, but it's quite rare. Let me tell you something. The greatest things we've ever learned as scholars about how teams can improve, how individuals can improve, don't cost a dime. They require thoughtfulness, like we're trying to be today, to think about these issues, and then a little bravery to go engage them. So anyone listening, I'm telling you right now, go find the next big meeting where there's an opportunity to maybe shift how others view you if you think that's useful and needed in your career, and pull out your 3-minute, 2-minute, 20 minutes is a little long, a mistake story, and laugh at yourself, throw yourself under the bus. Don't blame anybody else except yourself, and watch how they look at you differently than they maybe normally do. That can start a conversation that's quite useful.
Yeah. And that's a great point. And it's something that I used to, now in kind of even knowing more today, or being hopefully more intelligent today than I was, several years ago as a manager, coming out front with those things and just kind of putting it out there rather than waiting for something to happen to make me talk about it actually ended up being a lot more beneficial, right? Because I would have conversations with my team about, hey, taking risks and, failing, and it's going to be okay. And I'm not going to fire you. Nobody else is going to fire you. Then I started to kind of tell a story about, hey, I paid out a 5-figure claim on a canceled policy. Oh, that was 12 years ago, and I'm still here, and I've been promoted since then. So it's we'll be fine. So but I used to hold that back, and I think if you just will say heck with it and just screw it, I'm going to get out there and I'm just going to put my mistakes on the table and let people know that you can make mistakes. You'll learn from it. I never paid another claim that was on a canceled policy ever again. Never, ever again. But, it's those kinds of things where it's like, all right, I'm not going to ever do that again. Or, you kind of do that course correction that gets there. But I think, again, back to the point, just come out with it, right? Like, don't necessarily have to wait for an event to take place, but just be open about your vulnerability.
They are defining learning moments, and others need to know that that's a natural process, not one to be shunned. So you used the word a little while ago, psychological safety. A lot of people talk about it, and I like it. So how do you create that? A little more authenticity, a little more vulnerability, laughing at yourself in the ways that we're talking about. I've even seen firms that are very interested in innovation create all kinds of mistake or failure libraries. Big famous design firm years ago, IDEO, kind of made this popular, and it's still around in different versions. Some of them are digital, some of them are actual physical things where we put products that didn't work. That normalizes learning and mistakes as a part of eventual innovations, because it's never like, I have an idea, let's apply it, and look how greatly successful it is. That's rare beyond words. Normally, it's experiment, try, fail, learn, experiment, try, fail, learn, and then 1 out of 10, 1 out of 15 times that a team does that, a big innovation does result that helps us in a useful way. That's the reality innovation. And if you want to make people comfort with that, you got to lead the way and show them that being imperfect in the service of learning is normal, and we can get smarter at it and a little better at it the more we talk about it instead of stigmatize it.
Yeah. Be the role model.
Yep.
Just be the role model in that case. Yeah, there's I know of one team where the leader of that team created a new award, and they called it the Screw Up of the Week. They had a more explicit term for the start of that, but they called it their Screw Up of the Week, and they wore it like a badge, right? It was a badge of honor to be given the Screw Up of the Week. Fun thing, happy thing. It just made it happen. But the point there was, again, kind of what you got back to, like, let's normalize that we're going to make a lot of mistakes on this team. We're going to get a few things right, and those are going to be what move the needle, right?
I really love that, man.
Those things. So, I thought it was a fantastic way to just make some light of it and bring some levity to the whole situation, and just give people that comfortability and safety that, hey, we're giving out awards.
Not everyone loves salty language, but I do. So I would find that absolutely hilarious. I've challenged people in a similar way many, many times. I say, look, think back over the last 3 to 5 years. Can you think of 1 or 2 immense, difficult to deal with personal failures that you've encountered as you were trying to achieve something that didn't work out? And if the answer is not sure I can, or just no, then you're not living right, because you're supposed to be failing and screwing up if you're trying hard enough in life. I hate to sound a little lofty, but man, I love hearing an operational example like that about that team. That's a beautiful thing, a great message they're sending.
Yeah, it is. And, for them, it works, and it, may not work for everybody. And then, there's some industries and spaces where you can't have that kind of mentality, right? But we weren't dealing in that space. We're not flying airplanes or, solving medical issues or anything like that, so we've got an ability to test and learn a little bit. So it was a really, like I said, it was a really nice way to normalize and have some fun with people making mistakes. So I thought that was really good. So, all right. Well, so I think we've kind of beat up these three pieces of foundation, leadership foundations, manager foundations, as we start to wrap up this show. So real quick, Todd, I know that you've got a lot of work out there. You've got a recent book drop that's come out, Live Hard. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, thanks, man. Sure. Live Hard is out. It's my second book of stories. It's 20 relatively short stories. The general theme across the book is overcoming fear of failure, living fearlessly, really trying to engage and take the risks associated with success in life and why that's worth it. Really fun, personal, emotional, funny stories. I would share that with everyone. And I would say also, I've become this guy who's known for a lot of courses people enjoy learning from. There's a big old library of courses. I think I've got 35 plus now over at LinkedIn Learning. If you haven't checked them out, maybe you'll give them a look.
Yeah. And, I have to say I've taken a couple of them, one, just prepping for the show, getting to know you a little bit further. But, again, just thinking about, these are incredible, just manager fundamentals. And you do a good job of getting into and kind of speaking about things that don't show up in the job description or that people don't tell you about, like, growing climbing the corporate ladder or anything like that, like how you have to deal with people issues. That never comes up, right? Like when you talk about
there wasn't a course on that in school.
Yeah, I was going to say that, even going through business school, right? Like you start to see a little bit more of it now, but very little EQ type of learning or anything that's going on in that space. It's all about the deliverables and the outcomes and finance pieces of it and stuff like that. And it's like, hey, you got to manage people, and getting through that. And there's some other research that shows that folks with humanities degrees and backgrounds actually show up to be better people leaders than people that have IT or business degrees or anything like that.
I've just because that. of that.
Yeah. And it made me think of my daughter, actually. She's going to school for elementary education, but she does a lot with theater, and she's always done a lot with theater. She can give feedback without even thinking about it, right? And just kind of like pops it off and does it in such a nice, like positive way that makes you want to be like, oh yeah, I'm going to go fix that now, and
it's a hugely valuable skill.
It absolutely is. And I think that humanities background and just kind of being in that space for so long that, that's so natural of what you do. You have to give each other feedback in that space. She's just so well trained in that now that it's like second nature. I'm like, that is a skill that you will be, tenfold above your peers when you show up in the workplace.
Wow. So, that's very cool.
All right, Todd. Hey, final thoughts, plugs. Where can people find you if they have questions?
Easy. I'm all over the web. The best way to find me is go to LinkedIn. If that is a platform you enjoy, I love it. Or my website, which is drdewett.com.
All right. Perfect. Todd, hey, you've been a fantastic guest. Dropped some great knowledge for the group here. I'm sure the listeners will be able to take away a lot. Hope we can do this again sometime. This has been really fun. Thank you.
Would love to. Thanks for having me, man.